Namaste and a warm welcome to the Ex-Christian Show, the insider view of Christianity from the outside. Now there's a passage in the Tanakh in the book of Isaiah chapter 44 verses 9 through 20. This passage is a discourse where the Israelite God Yahweh, through his prophet Isaiah, is telling the Israelites about the worthlessness of making and worshipping idols. The passage calls idol worship abominable and says that people who worship idols will perish. Strangely, Christianity imputes this passage to Hindus. Proselytizers use this passage to convert Hindus by threatening them of the consequences of idol worshipping. Why am I calling this strange? Because Christians, especially proselytizers in India, do not want to have anything to do with the Old Testament. That's where this passage is written. There are several verses and passages and events and stories in the Tanakh that make proselytizers uncomfortable. It invites criticism from the people that they are proselytizing, which is why they try to avoid these verses and these events. But for the sake of proselytizing, they choose this passage because it talks extensively about idol worshipping and worthlessness of idol worshipping and making idols. Not just the proselytizers, many Hindu converts cite this as a reason for abandoning their Hindu roots. The truth is, like everything else from the Bible, this verse too has no bearing on Hindus. In this video, I'm going to prove that the discourse was targeted at Assyrian forms of worshipping idols, which was not even remotely close to Vigraha Pooja of Hindus, and I will also prove that it was meant only for the Israelites and not for anybody outside of that race. And how will I do that? By interpreting the text in light of contexts within which it was written. I repeat, contexts and not just one context. But before I do that, I want to make a small note about contexts. Biblical critics like me are accused of interpreting biblical verses out of context to make our point. What if I told you that it is only by reading in context that the Bible presents more problems than when read as standalone passages? For starters, it annuls the claim that the Bible is applicable to all times and to all cultures. Let me explain. Many Christians cry context. What do I mean by that? Anytime I make a reference of a biblical verse or a passage in my videos, I find a lot of Christians commenting that I have pulled out a verse out of its context and am interpreting it in isolation. They cry context. When they do that, they only have one aspect in mind, the literary context, the verses that precede and the verses that follow the text that I have referenced. Most Christians do not even know that to interpret a biblical verse or passage, there are other contexts involved, and they are stuck to the literary context. So what other contexts are we talking about besides the literary context? We're talking about historical, political, cultural, social, and geographical setting within which the text was written. We're talking about who the author is. Who is he writing for? As in his audience. What is his purpose in writing the text? What is his role in the society he is living in and is writing for? And finally, the literary context. Talking about the literary context, it's not just about what verses precede and what verses follow the text under examination. Literary context extends to what genre of literature is the text written in. Is it poetry or prose? If it is poetry, is it praise and worship or is it lamentation? If it is prose, is it idiomatic or prophetic or allegorical? Now, while the contexts are on one side, there's another aspect which has to be closely examined too, and that is how, if at all, the text fits into the overall message, overall narrative. So let's examine each context. I will begin by setting the historical tone. The beginning of the Hebrew race. That's where I'll begin. So the beginning of Hebrew race goes back to 1200 BCE Starting 1200, they coexisted with several other races in the Mediterranean region. The religions followed by these races, their religious symbols, and their deities were almost same, with very slight variations in terms of the names of the deities and the methods of worship and sacrifice. The Hebrews had powerful empires like the Assyrians and Egyptians and the Babylonians for their neighbors. Each of these empires vied to become the rulers of the world. The Hebrews, on the other hand, they simply wanted to establish their theocracy. To achieve that, they consolidated themselves into tribes first and then into monarchies, thus forming the Jewish Commonwealth. At some point after that, they declared themselves to be monolaterous and abandoned the worship of other gods and idols that their pagan ancestors worshipped. Note that I used the word monolaterous and not monotheists. Now, monolatry is the worldview that accepts the existence of other gods but chooses to worship only one. And this is different from monotheism, which is the belief that there is only one God. So by declaring themselves monolaterous, the Jews distinguished themselves from the pagans in the region. Now let's move to the contexts. I want you to note that the contexts overlap as we examine them, so please follow closely. First comes the political context. What were the political events leading up to the writing of this passage? That is the question the political context addresses. Roughly during the 9th century, the reign of the 4th Jewish monarchy started. This was the time when the much famed king of Israel, Solomon, died. At this time, a civil war broke out between the already fractured 12 tribes of Israel. It resulted in the division of the Jewish Commonwealth into two nations, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Some 200 years after the division of the Jewish nation in 722 BCE, the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians. As per the Assyrian military policy, the Israelites were sent to Assyria as captives by the Assyrian king. 200 years after the fall of Israel, in 587 BCE, Babylonians captured the southern kingdom, Judah. They destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The Judeans were exiled to Babylon. The Judeans began living with the Assyrians. Now understand that the Judeans were monolaterous and the Assyrians were pagans. So 50 years they lived together. In 539 BCE, 50 years later that is, Babylon was conquered by the Persians. The Achaemenid Persian Empire Cyrus allowed the Judeans to go home and rebuild their temple. Politically though, Judah was retained as a Persian province. That's the political context. Now the second context is the authorship and dating, which is when was the passage written and by whom. The book of Isaiah has 66 chapters, and interestingly it has 3 authors. That's what the textual scholars have concluded. Scholars named these 3 divisions as Proto-Isaiah, the first Isaiah, who penned chapters 1 through 39. Deutero-Isaiah, or the second Isaiah, who penned chapters 40 to 55. And Trito-Isaiah, or third Isaiah, who wrote chapters 56 to 66. A time gap of at least 200 years between the first and the second Isaiahs has been identified. The last 10 chapters by Trito-Isaiah have been written at a much later indeterminate time. Now the text in question, which is the passage that we are examining, falls in the writings of Deutero, or the second Isaiah, written by some anonymous writer who subscribed to the Jewish theocracy and their separatist ideology. It has been written during the rise of the First Persian Empire in the 5th century BCE, placing the passage toward the final phase of the Babylonian exile sometime before Cyrus sent the exiles home. The third is a very important context, and this is the theological context. What were the theological beliefs of the Israelites? Like all races of the Mediterranean, the ancient Israelites also saw the world through a religious lens. In their understanding, military might and victories in wars were direct fruits of fearing their chosen deity and being faithful to him or her. And defeat in war meant faithlessness to the chosen deity. When the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, its sister nation Judea was a witness to the bloodshed, rape, and pillage. They were terrified. So were the priests and prophets. Now note that the priests and the prophets were the people on whom the Israelite folks depended on for their spiritual needs. The prophets of Judea did what they were called to do: caution through prophecies. They exhorted their own people that the reason Israel fell was because Yahweh allowed it to fall as a punishment for engaging in a syncretistic form of religion. In other words, worshipping idols. The prophets warned their people that Judea would meet the same fate if they too worshipped idols. This scared the Judeans, and they tried very hard to not fall into it. But militarily weak, they had no choice of who they worshipped. Many a time, Judea was a vassal kingdom under the pagan kings who installed their own gods in the Jerusalem temple, if they pleased, that is. The vassal Judean king and the people were forced to follow pagan gods. This chagrined the prophets, and they criticized and issued warnings of fall of the kingdom. In just 135 years after the fall of Israel, Judea too fell to the Babylonians, and in the most horrible manner. This time, even their otherwise mighty and powerful God's abode was leveled by the pagan enemies. The Judeans were sent as exile to Babylon. Imagine the thought process of the Judeans. For no fault of theirs, they had to face defeat and exile. Why do I say it was not their fault? Because if worshipping other gods was their fault, it was their God who allowed pagan installation of other gods in the Jerusalem temple. They were confused and did not know what to make of this fall. How could the pagans defeat the chosen children of the Most High God? If pagan gods were false, how could they overthrow the true and mighty God of the universe who created the entire universe with just a command? They had reason to conclude that probably the captors' gods, that is the pagan gods, were mightier than Yahweh. Probably the pagan gods will be able to protect them if they worshipped the pagan gods also along with Yahweh. In the 50 years they coexisted with the Assyrians, the Judeans had lost their sense of monolatry and had adapted to syncretistic forms of worship. Then came the time for them to go home under Cyrus's rule. They had work to do on native soil, that of renewing their covenant with Yahweh, reinstating their theocracy, and rebuilding their temple. For this, they would have to leave behind their syncretistic idol worship that they had gotten used to. Enter the prophets again, this time merely telling that the Jewish God was mighty wasn't enough. The prophets figured this. They had to point out the worthlessness of the pagan gods that the Judeans had embraced, that the Judeans had started praising and worshipping. So the prophet goes into details of how those idols are worthless because they were made by human hands and carved out of the same wood that was used for other household purposes. These are all the contexts: the political, the theological, and the authorship and dating. With those contexts examined, let me explain the purpose behind the writing of this passage. Popular biblical commentaries like Matthew Henry's, which by the way was my favorite as an apologetic student, say that this discourse was delivered with the following purposes in mind. Number one, to arm the Israelites against the temptation to worship idols. Note the phrase arm the Israelites. He doesn't say to arm all races against the temptation to worship idols. And how is it a temptation? What is so tempting about worshipping idols? Secondly, to cure them, that is the Israelites, of idolatry. Cure? It's not an infection. Thirdly, to elevate the Israelite God. Not God in general, the Israelite God. Fourthly, to take off their fear of the gods of their enemies. Fifthly, to encourage their hope in their own God that he would certainly come to their rescue and vanquish his competitors. Lastly, the most interesting of all, to furnish the Israelites with something to say to when their Assyrian taskmasters would mock them, saying, "Where is your God?" To which the Israelites are supposed to counter-question, "What are your gods?" Do you see where the what about originates from? This is called tu quoque, logical fallacy. It is a Latin word for you also. It's a retort, accusing an accuser of a similar offense or similar behavior. It is an appeal to hypocrisy. When we sum all of this, what do we have? A diktat to the Israelites and a criticism of the Assyrian idols. For millennia before the emergence of the Jewish race, idol worship was a universally accepted form of worshipping and connecting with the divine. In fact, it was the only form of worshipping deities. Chosen deities found equal place as the kings in the annals of the powerful kingdoms in the ancient world. The Israelite prophets, who came very late into a world very old, were cognizant of the fact that they neither had the military might or the cultural standing to dictate terms and conditions of how pagans must worship their gods. The most they could do was criticize pagan ways in their own oral and written traditions and prescribe rules for worshipping their own deity, Yahweh, and warned their own people to stay away from pagan ways. That is exactly what they were doing in this passage. Before I go, let me just say this. Even in this day and age, the complex philosophy behind Vigraha Pooja is not fully comprehensible by a majority of people in the world, including Hindus themselves. There is no way that the Tanakh writers of any century had any clue about how things worked in the Sanatana culture, of which they never even heard. They knew of their limitation and operated well within those limits. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in another episode. Until then, namaste.